The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
Now the saint we're going to begin with today is Saint Irenaeus, certainly part of the early church. So let's talk about his birth and his death and put that into context.
Well, we know that he's born in the year 130 in Turkey and that he dies in the year 202 in France. He was the Bishop of Gaul as part of the Roman Empire. So not the France we think of today. He wasn't the Archbishop of Paris, but in the early foundings of the church. One of the things that we know is that he heard the preaching of another saint, Saint Polycarp, and that Polycarp was a disciple of John. So one of the things is, as we look at Irenaeus, and we've talked about this beautiful gift of generations, that this is one of these examples where we really can trace. We don't have to do much work to trace back to Jesus himself. That John was the beloved disciple, that Polycarp is a disciple of John, and that then through Polycarp's preaching, Irenaeus hears the word of God and dedicates his life to this ministry. All happening while the church is illegal. So putting all of those other cautions on their lives, but seeing that just in Irenaeus we can go within three people back to Jesus himself.
When we mention Irenaeus and you mentioned Polycarp, those two are considered church fathers. Mm-hmm. And that bears in mind that in the Catholic Church, we certainly believe in the sacred scriptures, but we also believe in the tradition and the magisterium of the church. Mm-hmm. So those two coupled together really helps with the foundation of who we are as a Catholic Church. And so church father would be those who would have had an early witness to the faith. And certainly, as you had mentioned, through Polycarp, through the Apostle John. So there's that whole sense that Irenaeus, as a church father, was teaching us something very important about the life of the early church. And as you had mentioned also, that this was a church that was in hiding, a church that was illegal, a church that was not allowed to publicly proclaim its truth and its faith. So what does that tell us about the early church fathers, some of the struggles that they go through? And then once we talk about that, let's talk specifically about some of the things that Irenaeus himself had actually proposed and championed as an early church father.
Well, one of the great challenges for the early church fathers would have been, again, we have a church founded by Jesus on Peter the Apostle and the other apostles. But with all due respect to the scriptures, we don't have much more. A lot of it has to be developed and formed. And so the writings of the early church fathers, their writings in developing the theology of the church becomes essential. But what happens also is you start to have little splinter groups, even early on, who interpret things a different way or evaluate the movement of the church in a different direction. And so you're going to have some great challenges in people of faith, but who see it moving forward in a different way. And so it really becomes, as the church evolves in those early centuries with all of the writings. I remember being in seminary and there were three books that we had that were the Psalms that we use in the Sunday Mass, but then each of them had some writing from an early church father, how they even saw that developing into how we would continue to pass on the faith. And so we know that it became very important, but we know that it was challenging because, as I said, there wasn't a clear framework. Mm-hmm. And so errors would come about, people would want to take the church in a different direction, and the faithful church fathers would really have to stand their ground and say, no, this is the direction that we are headed.
And I think as we talk about Irenaeus, and we'll talk about some subsequent saints who also made great strides in ensuring that the truth be told about Christ and about the church, because that was what they were struggling with in the early church. We know, of course, the whole struggle against Arianism. Is Jesus fully God or is Jesus fully human? Jesus is both. And so there's that whole sense that one of the other things that crept into the early church that in particular Irenaeus was battling was Gnosticism. So he's really kind of known for that. And so there's this other part of the recognition that we find with Irenaeus, and that is his ability to unite both the Eastern and the Western church. We also mentioned that he is highly revered by the Orthodox Church as well. So his influence in the life of the early church is monumental, and especially as an Eastern church father. Let's talk also about some of the sense of his fight for the early doctrines of the church and the primacy of Rome. Let's talk exactly what do we mean by that?
Well, as you alluded to, some of the earliest doctrines of the church we see Irenaeus putting forward about that primacy of Rome. And so when we talk about primacy of Rome, we're talking about the Roman See. We're talking about it having primacy over all other dioceses, over all other aspects of the church. And really what we're talking about that is the power and the position of the Pope. That the Holy Father, the See of Rome, the Bishop of Rome, is the one who has the ultimate authority over the church. And we'll see, not only in the early church, but then we'll see in other periods, this kind of battle that will emerge from time to time about movement of the See, not recognizing that as the ultimate authority. But Irenaeus, even in this early time period, is one who really does write and battle and fight for that emergence, that it is the primacy of Rome, founded on Peter and the apostles, that is the guidance and the leadership of the church.
And we'll know subsequently with the Edict of Milan in Constantine creating a new see in Istanbul, in Constantinople. And so there's that whole sense that, this historically the primacy of Rome continues to be developed and fought for. And so in closing, before we get to our next saint, we'd like to encourage the folks that are with us to learn more about the saints that we talk about. Irenaeus is an early church father. I'm sure that the folks can go to Church Fathers in Google or whatever their search engine is and look at all of those number of church fathers that have influenced us and have helped us as the magisterium traditional sense of who we are as Catholic. We're going to take a break and talk about another saint in a moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her.
Instead of sitting on the couch, I hope to clean up.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I sent my husband a love email.
What have I done for my marriage today? It's a good question.
I gave her a call and say, thinking of her. And the kids.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
We're going to the museums as a family.
What have I done for my marriage today?
I made my wife coffee and breakfast this morning.
It's going to be her birthday next week, so I've been spending time today making arrangements to make that extra special.
Oh, we're spending the day together?
I bought her an orchid.
Hassan was able to let me sleep in by taking care of him in the morning.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. She's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Small changes can make a world of difference. Get started at foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
Every heart wants to grow. Every mind needs to know. Every voice wants the chance to be heard.
By the time we can walk, each of us yearns for the joy that comes from being able to do for ourselves.
Let us all share the joy.
Around the block or around the world, share the joy. Church World Service.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about Saint Bonaventure. We know that he is a Franciscan But there's much more that we are going to share with the folks that are with us. So let's start with where he was born and where he died.
He was born in Viterbo, Italy in 1220, and he dies in 1274. So he lives throughout the midst of the 13th century. We know that he was canonized just 200 years later. So we'll get to more about his life of faith and what that actually meant for the church. We know that he was also declared a doctor of the church about 100 years after his canonization. And we've talked a little bit about what that doctor of the church means, that we're not talking about a medical doctor, but we're talking about someone who is perhaps a scholar whose writings are those that guide and encourage and lead people forward, that have such an important role in the church that they are given this distinction. So we know that that would have been part of Bonaventure's gift to the church. And we know that he was a Franciscan scholar, a theologian, a writer and philosopher. We know that he also becomes a cardinal archbishop. So it's interesting, again, we've talked about people in monastic communities. He's a Franciscan. He's already part of this life, perhaps, of being one of the scholars in the community, one who's involved in a great deal of theological work, but then asked to move on to become, an archbishop, a cardinal. And while we might see great governance in the church, we've talked about, ultimately, a bishop is the one who governs and cares for his people. So to take all of his scholarly work and to now allow it to be put into practice in his interaction with his community.
I'd like to go back to the place of his birth, and that is Viterbo. Viterbo geographically is just outside the city of Rome. It's really where the conclaves first got its name. Let's explain to the folks that are with us, what is a conclave?
Well, the conclave is, of course, we would know it most recently in the election of Pope Francis, is that coming together of the cardinals of the church to select the successor of the most recently deceased Holy Father. Now, in our current time, we saw it through the retirement, if you will, of Pope Benedict. But oftentimes in the history of the church, the vast majority of times, it is that the one Holy Father dies, and then all of the cardinals, princes of the church, are brought together to elect their successor. Oftentimes, that successor comes from within the conclave itself. Oftentimes, it is a cardinal. There have been some times where it has not been a cardinal in the church. It might be interesting to our viewers that any adult baptized male is eligible to be pope. It is highly unlikely, but that is the ultimate requirement. Most of the time it's going to come from those who themselves are electing.
And the word conclave really comes from the Italian con chiave, which means with a key. Mm-hmm. And so traditionally the cardinals were kind of locked away in this private discernment process to call upon the Holy Spirit to help them decide the next Holy Father. The interesting thing about Viterbo was that they were trying for several years to try to select and elect another Holy Father. Because they couldn't do it and the faithful got rather indignant about it, they actually locked the cardinals in the church and would not let them out until they decided on the new Holy Father. And so hence we get the word conclave, conclave with the key. Let's go into something also very interesting in the life of St. Bonaventure, and that is that he was very significant in what we call the Second Council of Lyon. Let's talk about the councils of the church. We know we've had 21 some councils, most recently within the last 50 years, Vatican II. What are the councils of the church and why do we have those in the church?
Well, the councils of the church, as you said, our most recent one, Second Vatican Council in the 60s, but we can go all the way back to one that is kind of, is it a council, is it not a council, but the first gathering of the church, of the leaders of the church, with the Council of Jerusalem, where we really have the factions of Peter and Paul debating this issue of circumcision, which really was debating the issue of, do you need to first be Jewish to become a Christian? And that sets up the pattern that in every one of these subsequent councils, there are periods in the life of the church where the leadership, called by the Holy Father, but the bishops come together, are called together to debate, to discern, and ultimately to decide on how the church is going to move forward. And so we see in some of those earlier councils in the 300s and 400s, we had the development of the Nicene Creed, beginning at Nicaea, but then subsequent additions and refinements to the creed that come from other councils to deal with issues of faith that have a great impact on the people of God. What is important about councils are there is that discernment, and then you move forward together with the decision that is made. We know that at times there have been people who were not able to move forward, and so then they end up sadly leaving the church because we move forward in unity.
And we know that the Second Council of Lyon in 1274 was primarily the fathers of the church getting together to unite the Greek and the Latin churches together in one union under the primacy of Rome. We know that you had mentioned earlier that Bonaventure was a medieval scholar and theologian and writer. We know that he wrote about Christ in particular, and what was something that he wrote to tell us about Christ and our eventual discipleship?
Well, one of the things that he wrote about, and it's interesting, he coins the phrase, this one true master. And because he was a scholar, he certainly talks about knowledge, and that knowledge begins with faith, that faith is the foundation of our relationship with the one true master, but that it develops through rational understanding. And one of the things that we talk about in the church, and we see it even in canon law and in other aspects of how we live our faith, is this bringing together of faith and reason. And that they are not unique from each other, but that they manifest together in this how we are to live our lives. And we know that he found this to be perfected in the mystical union of God, that it was faith and reason, that this knowledge of who God is in this rational understanding, but always with the underpinnings of faith. And I think sometimes when we see debates in the church, sometimes it's too much of a rational, reason, mindset oriented, or it's only faith. And what we really do is we bring the two together, that faith is tempered by that knowledge, but that knowledge should not dismiss that true faith.
We're going to talk about another saint in a moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Whether it's passing on medicine, a blanket, or something as simple as a glass of water, that's how compassion works. And that's how Irenaeus works, hand to hand to hand. For nearly 100 years, Irenaeus been passing on your help to the priests and brothers working in 26 countries around the world. Irenaeus, an American Catholic organization, dedicates 86 cents of every dollar donated to their programs, serving the world's poor and powerless. And that's how it works. Compassion flows from your hand to the hand of someone in need. Hand to hand to hand. That's Irenaeus.
That's Irenaeus.
That's Irenaeus.
That's Irenaeus.
That's Irenaeus. That's Irenaeus.
That's Irenaeus.
That's Irenaeus. That's Irenaeus. That's Irenaeus.
By the time we can walk, each of us yearns for the joy that comes from being able to do for ourselves. Church World Service believes that being self-reliant is a joy everyone should share. So around the block or around the world, share the joy. Church World Service.
We are in our 7th year, Cristo Rey Jesuit High School. It arose from the desire of the Jesuits in the Chicago province to serve the Hispanic community here in Chicago. One of the things that's unique about this school is that our kids work 5 days a month at offices in downtown Chicago to pay for their education. That idea originated here. We got telephone calls the first day from the companies thanking us for sending us those kids to their companies. The companies feel good about themselves. 95% of our kids are the first ones in their families to finish high school, and 87% of our graduates are in college right now. This project attracts wonderful, wonderful, enthusiastic, idealistic people. They have to have the desire to kind of reach for the stars. No one believed that it would be as successful as it is. Well, it's obviously caught on, and we're very, very excited about it.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about St. Henry. He really has a rich background. Like many of the saints, we're very familiar with him. So let's kind of set the scene for the folks that are with us about his birth, his death, and his life.
Well, Henry's born in 972 and he dies in 1024, so a little over 50 years old. We know that when he was born, his father was the Duke of Bavaria. And so upon his father's death, he succeeds to that title. And so part of a noble family, but the eldest son, so he assumes the title. We've talked about some other noble families where perhaps the person we're talking about was the third or fourth child, and so they don't inherit the title and they may go off to another profession. We know that when his cousin Otto III dies, in addition to being the Duke of Bavaria, he becomes the emperor. Now, one of the things that's interesting about him is that while as emperor and as duke, he has a great care for the church and this unity of the church and the empire, but we'll talk a little bit more. His ultimate goal was to become a monk. So this is the example where someone who really is called to assume this position in his family, he would have been most happy becoming a monk.
You know, we've talked about that before in the lives of many of the saints who have been monks in a Benedictine community and were called to serve the church as a bishop. And so they were called out of that comfort zone, so to speak. And here we have someone who, because of the right of succession, becomes emperor, really wants to spend his whole life in a monastic life. But see, subsequently we see that, you know, that is not his charge in life. And so we give St. Henry credit for standing up to what the dictates were for his life and also his charge at the time. We do know that his wife is also a saint. So let's talk about her.
Well, and his wife Kunigunda. So the two of them are saints, very well known and honored in Bavaria and beyond. But we know that although Henry decides not to abdicate from the life that he has been called to, he and his wife discover a way in which they can still live this life of faith. And so they take their power and their prestige as emperor and empress to really unite with the church, to care for the poor, to care for the uneducated, to care for the sick and the abandoned. And they really kind of run the empire as if it were a diocese, in sense of their care and their compassion and their concern. We know that he received an excellent education and sought to pass on that gift of knowledge, but always tempered with that love and dedication and determination to witness to Christ Jesus to everybody and to raise people up to a dignity of life.
We know that most of the saints, if not all of the saints, are patrons of something or another. We know, for example, St. Jude is the patron of lost causes. Or when someone loses something, I always say, pray to St. Anthony and you'll find it. So we know that that's part of the life of saints. What in particular is St. Henry known for and is patron of? And let's talk about those and why perhaps.
Well, two sound to be in keeping with the church and two sound a little narrow. He's the patron of those who are childless and also the patron of those who suffer from a physical ailment that provides, is lived out as in a handicap. But then he's also the patron of dukes. Well, that's a little narrow window there. But also those rejected by religious orders. And I think that certainly is manifested by his rejection was not from the religious community. His rejection was his own call to give in to those who urged him not to abdicate, and that he could help the church and help the people of God by staying as the emperor. So many saints have various patronages. The childless, he and his wife, their commitment to God is that they would not care for their own children, but that they would care for all of God's children. So we see that patronage to those who, for whatever reasons, do not have children, those who have physical infirmities, but also those in nobility and those who are not able to live out a religious life.
And we would certainly encourage the folks that are with us to learn more about their own patron saint or their namesake, because I think that's really an opportunity for us to kind of align ourselves with the saints and what they stand for, what their charism is. And I think that's really an opportunity for us to draw closer to the lives of the saints within our own Catholic faith, but also in our own everyday life. The other interesting thing is that when you talk about St. Henry wanting to really abdicate and spend his life in a monastery, and subsequently didn't, that tells us that oftentimes, we are called to many things, and we can choose to do them or not to do them. And it's important for us to really kind of take the higher road to see what is the greater good, what is the most important thing, or what is it that God really is calling me to do, so I can live my life as the best that I can, but also living it in concert with His will for me. And so we certainly see that in the life of St. Henry and the life of his wife, St. Kunigunda, that we're called sometimes to do things that we may not want to do, but it's important for us to recognize that. And what would be some of those things that we're called to do that we just kind of shy away from, especially in regards to the life of the church?
Well, excuse me, I know in my own vocation, there have been assignments that I've been asked to consider and take that weren't initially ones that I would have thought of, but they've been the most fulfilling. Because I don't go into them with any preconceived notions or ideas, or all like say, this is all I've ever wanted, this is all I ever wanted to be. And I think sometimes people in any vocation, in any way of life, sometimes when you have it all mapped out and you narrowly define it, again, it has to be this, and I want this, and I'm going to do it that way, that disappointment is just not too far away. But when we open ourselves up to, again, as we've mentioned even with vocations, allowing other people to recognize gifts and talents, nurturing us, encouraging us, perhaps asking us to do something that we on our own would not have chosen, I think there's times when we actually find the greater joy. If simply not, I never thought I could do this, or that's not anything I ever thought I would do. And sometimes when we reflect on those moments, that's where we find the greater joy, because of the accomplishments and the successes that come out of these never thought of opportunities.
And I think in close also to highlight the fact that Henry and Kunigunda were husband and wife and were saints, were called to a life of holiness. And so married couples through their own sacrament are called to a holy life and a holy vocation as married persons. And so we would encourage them to look upon Henry and Kunigunda, strange names, as really patrons for them in their own married life, in their own vocations. And we certainly thank the folks that are with us for watching Communion of Saints. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.